Welcome back to Man and Technics by Oswald Spengler. There have been a lot of changes since chapter 3, and I will try to go over them quickly. I listened back to chapter 3 and it sounded bad. I can't quite put my finger on it, but it just sounded bad. I didn't enjoy listening to it, so I tried to change some things around. And what I came up with, I think it doesn't sound perfect, but it sounds a lot better, in my opinion. And then my computer crashed and I lost the PDF that I had open in my browser. So I had to find a new one. And here we go. This looks better, and it might actually help me read better. I read somewhere that like having a smaller text is better for audiobook narration because your eyes kind of grasps more of the text and you don't have to jump lines so often. I don't know. We'll try it out. Looks good at least. And hopefully this also sounds good. Oh, and I'm also recording standing up now. So yeah, I might actually re-record chapter 1 to 3 once I'm done with this, or once I got more used to doing audiobooks. I have a routine going. I kind of actually know what I'm doing. But yeah, that's just some quick announcements. Let's get into it. Chapter 4, the second stage, Speech and Enterprise. 7. How long ago the age of the armed man lasted? I really made a mistake there. 7. How long ago the age of the armed hand lasted? That is, since when has man been man? We do not know. In any case, the total of years does not matter, although today we still set it far too high. It is not a matter of millions of years, nor even of several hundreds of thousands. Nevertheless, a considerable number of millennia must have flowed away. But now comes a second epoch-making change, as abrupt and as immense as the first, and like it, transforming man's destiny from the foundations. Once more, a true mutation, in the sense indicated above. Prehistoric archaeology observed this long ago, and in fact, the things that lie in our museums do suddenly begin to look different. Clay vessels appear, and traces of agriculture and cattle breeding, though this is a rash use of terms that connote something much more modern. Hut building, graves, indications of travel. A new world of technical ideas and processes sets in. The museum standpoint, which is far too superficial and obsessed with the mere ordering of finds, has differentiated older and newer Stone Ages, the Paleolithic and the Neolithic. This 19th century classification has long been regarded with uncomfortable doubts, and in the last few decades attempts have been made to replace it by something else. But scholars are still sticking to the idea of classifying objects as terms like Mesolithic, Neolithic, and Mixolithic or Mesolithic. And hence they are getting no further. What changed was not equipment, but man. Once more, it is only from his soul that man's history can be discovered. The date of this mutation can be fixed with fair accuracy as being somewhere in the 5th millennium before Christ. 2,000 years later at most, the high cultures are beginning in Egypt and Mesopotamia. Truly the tempo of history is working up tragically. Hitherto thousands of years have scarcely mattered at all, but now every century becomes important. With tearing leaps, the rolling stone is approaching the abyss. But what in fact has happened? If one goes more deeply into this new form world of man's activities, one soon perceives most bizarre and complicated linkages. These techniques, one and all, presuppose one another's existence. The keeping of tame animals demands the cultivation of forage stuffs. The sowing and reaping of food plants require draught animals and beasts of burden to be available, and these again the construction of pens. Every sort of building requires the preparation and transport of materials, and transport, again, roads and pack animals and boats. What in all this is the spiritual transformation? The answer I put forward is this: collective doing by plan. Hitherto, each man has lived his own life, made his own weapons, followed his own tactics in the daily struggle. None needed another. This is what suddenly changes now. The new processes take up long periods of time, in some cases years. Consider the time that elapses between the felling of the tree and the sailing of the ship that is built out of it. The story that divides itself into a well-arranged set of separate acts and a set of plots, working out in parallel in one another. And for this collective procedure, the indispensable prerequisite is a medium language. Speaking in sentences and words, therefore, cannot have begun either earlier or later, but must have come just then, quickly, like everything decisive, and moreover in close connection with man's new methods. This can be proved. What is speaking? Indubitably, a process having for its object the imparting of information, an activity that is practiced continuously by a number of human beings amongst themselves. Speech or language is only an abstraction from this, the inner grammatical form of speaking, and therewith of words. This form must be common property and must have a certain permanence if information is really to be imparted by its means. I have elsewhere shown that speaking in sentences is preceded by simpler forms of communication, such as signs for the eye, signals, gestures, warning and threatening calls. All these continue in use, even today, as auxiliaries to speaking, as melodious speech, emphasis, play of features and hands, and, in written speech, punctuation. Nevertheless, fluent speaking is, by reason of its content, something quite new. Ever since Hamann and Herder, men have been setting themselves the question of its origin. But if all answers so far have been more or less unsatisfactory, it is because the intention of the question has been wrong. For the origin of speaking in words is not to be found in the activity of speaking itself. That was the error of the Romantics who, remote as ever from actuality, deduced speech from the primary poesy of mankind. Nay, more, they thought that speech itself was poesy. Myth, lyric, and prayer rolled into one, and that prose was merely something later and degraded for common everyday use. But had this been so, the inner form of the speaking, the grammar, the logical build of the sentence, would have borne quite a different look. In reality, it is precisely the very primitive languages, such as those of Bantu and Turkoman tribes, that show most emphatically the tendency to mark differences clearly, sharply, and unmistakably. This, in turn, brings us to the fundamental error of those sworn foes of Romanticism, the rationalists, who are forever chasing the idea that what the sentence expresses is a judgment or a thought. They sit at their writing tables, surrounded by books, and research into the minutiae of their own thoughts and writings. Consequently, the thought appears to them as the object of speaking, and, since usually they sit alone, they forget that beyond the speaking there is hearing, beyond a question an answer, beyond an ego a tu. They say speech, but what they mean is the oration, the lecture, the discourse. Their view of the origin of speech is, therefore, false, for they look upon it as a monologue. The correct way of putting the question is not how, but when did speaking in words come into existence? And once this question takes this form, all very soon becomes clear. The object of speaking in sentences usually misunderstood or ignored is settled by the period in which it became customary to speak thus, that is, fluently, and displayed quite clearly in the form of sentence building. Speaking did not arise by way of monologue, nor sentences by way of oratory. The source is in the conversation of several persons. The object is not one of understanding. The object is not one of understanding as a consequence of reflection, but one of reciprocal understanding as a consequence of question and answer. What, then, are the basic forms of the speaking? Not the judgment and declaration, but the command, the expression of obedience, the enunciation, the question, the affirmation or negation. These are sentences originally quite brief, which are invariably addressed to others, such as do this, ready, yes, go ahead. Words are designations of notions, are only products of the object of the sentence, and hence it is that the vocabulary of a hunting tribe is from the outset different from that of a village, of cowherds, or a seafaring coastal population. Originally, speaking was a different activity. It may be assumed that it was limited to bare essentials. Even today, the peasant is slow of speech, and compared with the townsman, who is so accustomed to speaking that he cannot hold his tongue and must, from mere boredom, chatter and make conversation as soon as he has nothing else to do, whether he has anything really to say or not. The original object of speech is the carrying out of an act, in accordance with intention, time, place, and means. Clear and unequivocal construction is therefore the first essential, and the difficulty of both conveying one's meaning to and imposing one's will on another procedure. Oh my god, I'm sorry. Clear and unequivocal construction is therefore the first essential, and the difficulty of both conveying one's meaning to and imposing one's will on another produced the technique of grammar, sentences, constructions, the correct modes of ordering, questioning, and answering, and the building up of classes of words on the basis of practical and not theoretical intentions and purposes. The part played by theoretical reflectiveness in the beginning of speaking in sentences was practically nil. All speech was of practical nature and proceeded from the thought of the hand. Okay, so now chapter 8, and then wow, that is a long road ahead. Chapter 8, no, not chapter 8, part 8. Collective doing by plan may be more briefly called an enterprise. Speech and enterprise stand in precisely the same relation to each other as the older pair, hand and implement. Speaking to several persons developed its inner grammatical form in the practice of carrying out jobs, and vice versa. The habit of doing jobs got its schooling from the methods of a thinking that had to work with words. For speaking consists in imparting something to another's thought. If speaking is an act, it is an intellectual act with sensuous means. Very soon it no longer needed the original immediate connection with physical doing. The epoch-making innovation of the 5th millennium BC was, in fact, that thereafter the thinking, the intellect, the reason, that which, call it by what name you please, had been emancipated by speech from dependence upon the doing hand, proceeded to set itself up against soul and life as a power in itself. The purely intellectual thinking over the calculation which emerges at this point, sudden, decisive, and radical, amounts to this, that collective doing is as effectively a unit as if it were the doing of some single giant. Or as Mephistopheles ironically says to Faust, "When to my car my monkey yokes 6 spankers are, their limbs not my limbs, is't not I on the proud racecourse that dash by? Mine all the forces I combine, the 24 legs are mine." Man, the preying animal, insists consciously on increasing his superiority far beyond the limits of his bodily powers. To this will to more power of his, he even sacrifices an important element of his own life. The thought of, the calculation for, intenser effectiveness comes first, and for the sake of it he is quite willing to give up a little of his personal freedom. Inwardly, indeed, he remains independent, but history does not permit one step to be taken back. Time and therefore life are irreversible. Once habituated to the collective doing and its successes, man commits himself more and more deeply to its fateful implications. The enterprise in the mind requires a firmer, arid... I'm sorry. The enterprise in the mind requires a firmer does it say arid? A firmer, arid, firmer hold on the life of the soul. I'm sure it says and, but that's a weird misprint. The enterprise in the mind requires a firmer and firmer hold on the life of the soul. Man has become the slave of his thought. The step from the use of personal tools to the common enterprise involves an immensely increased artificiality of procedure. The mere working with artificial material, as in pottery, weaving, and matting, does not as yet mean a great deal, although even it is something much more intelligent and creative than anything before it. But traces have come down to us of some few processes, standing far above the many but more ordinary kinds of which today we can know nothing, which presuppose very great powers of thought indeed. I'm sorry, I'm not even getting what I read myself. Let's read that again. But traces have come down to us of some few processes, standing far above the many of more ordinary kinds of which today we can know nothing, which presuppose very great powers of thought indeed. Above all, those which grew out of the idea of building. Long before there was any knowledge of metals, there were flint mines in Belgium, England, Austria, Sicily, and Portugal, complete with shafts and galleries, ventilation and drainage, and tools fashioned of deer horn, which certainly go back to these times. In the early Neolithic period, Portugal and northwestern Spain had close relations with Brittany, passing round southern France, and Brittany in turn with Ireland, which presupposes regular navigation, and therefore the building of seaworthy ships of some sort. though we know nothing about these. There are megaliths in Spain built of hewn stones of vast size, with capstones weighing more than 100 tons, which must have been brought from great distances and placed in position somehow, though again we know nothing of the technique employed. In truth, have we any clear notion of how much thought, consultation, superintendence, ordering was required over months and years on end for the quarrying and transport of this material, for the assignment of tasks in time and space, the planning, the undertaking, and execution of such work? How compare the prolonged forethought necessary for the transportation across the open sea with the production of a flint knife? Even the composite bow, which appears in Spanish rock pictures of the period, demands for its construction sinews, horn, and special woods, all from different sources, as well as a complicated process of manufacture that took 5 to 7 years. And the discovery, as we so naively call it, of the wagon. How much thinking, ordering, and doing it presupposes, ranging from the determination of the purpose and kind of movement required, the choice and preparation of the road, a point usually ignored, and the provision or breaking in of draught animals, to consideration of the bulk, weight, and lashing of the load, the management and housing of the convoy. Another and quite different world of creations arises out of the thought of procreation, namely the breeding of plants and animals, in which man himself takes the place of nature and creatrix? In which man himself takes the place of nature, the creatrix, imitates her, modifies her, improves on her, overrides her. From the time when he began cultivating instead of gathering plants, there is no doubt that he consciously modified them for his own ends. At any rate, the specimens discovered belong to species that have never been found in a wild state. And even in the oldest finds of animal bones that indicate cattle keeping of any sort, we perceive already the consequences of domestication, which partly, if not wholly, must have been intentional and brought about by deliberate breeding. The prey idea of the carnivore at once widens and includes not only the slain victims of the hunt, but also the free cattle that graze freely within, or even without, a man-made hedge. They belong to someone, a clan, a hunting group, and the owner will fight to maintain his right of exploitation. The capture of animals for breeding purposes, which presupposes the cultivation of foodstuffs for them, is only one of the many modes of possession then practiced. I have already shown that the birth of the armed hand let me read that again. I have already shown that the birth of the armed hand had as its result a logical separation of two techniques, namely that of making and that of using the weapon. Similarly, the verbally managed enterprise led to the separation of the activities of thought from those of the hand. In every enterprise, planning out and carrying out are distinct elements, and as between these, practical thought, henceforth takes the leading part. There is director's work and there is executant's work. And this fact has been the basic technical form of all human life ever since. Whether it is a matter of hunting big game or building temples, an enterprise of war or of rural development, the founding of a firm or of a state, a caravan journey or a rebellion or even a crime, always the first prerequisite is an enterprising, inventive head to conceive the idea, that direct the execution, to command and allot the roles. In a word, someone who is born to be a leader of others who are not so. I'm sorry, I'm making quite a lot of mistakes. I don't know why. But let's continue. For in this age of verbally managed enterprises, there are not only two sorts of techniques. These, by the way, diverging more and more definitely as the centuries go on, but also two kinds of man, differentiated by the fact of their talent lying in one or the other direction. As in every process, there is a technique of direction and a technique of execution. So equally self-evident, there are men whose nature is to command and men whose nature is to obey, subjects and objects of the political or economic process in question. This is the basic form of human life, that since the change has assumed so many and various shapes, and it is only to be eliminated along with life itself. Admittedly, this is artificial, contrary to nature, but that is just what culture is. Fate may ordain, and at times does ordain, that man should imagine himself able to abolish it artificially, but nevertheless it is unshakably a fact. Governing, deciding, guiding, commanding is an art, a difficult technique, and like any other, it presupposes an innate talent. Only children imagine that a king goes to bed with his crown, and only submen of the monster city, Marxists and literary people, imagine the same sort of thing about business kings. Undertaking is work, and it is only as a result of that work that the manual labor becomes possible. Similarly, the discovery, thinking out, cultivation, and management of new processes is a creative activity of gifted heads, and the executive role falls to the uncreative as a necessary consequence. And here we meet an old friend, now a little out of date, the question of genius and talent. Genius is, literally, creative power, the divine spark in the individual life, that in the stream of the generations mysteriously and suddenly appears, is extinguished, and a generation later reappears with equal suddenness. Talent is a gift for particular tasks already there, which can be developed by tradition, teaching, training, and practice to high effectiveness. Talent in its exercise presupposes genius, and not vice versa. Finally, there is a natural distinction of grade between men born to command and men born to serve, between the leaders and the led of life. The existence of this distinction is a plain fact, and in healthy periods and by healthy peoples, it is admitted, even if unwillingly, by everyone. In the centuries of decadence, the majority force themselves to deny or to ignore it, but the very insistence on the formula that all men are equal shows that there is something here that has to be explained away. And now for part 9. That is 3 pages. Let's see if my throat already is starting to hurt. I hope that goes away as I practice more and more reading out loud. But if not, that would suck. Part 9. Now, this verbally managed enterprise involves an immense loss of freedom, the old freedom of the beast of prey, for the leader and the led alike. They both become intellectual, spiritual members of a higher unit, body and soul. This we call organization, the gathering of active life into definite forms, into the condition of being in form, for the enterprise, whatever it may be. With collective doing, the decisive step is taken from organic to organized life, from living in natural to living in artificial groupings, from the pack to the people, the tribe, the social class, the state. And out of the combats of individual carnivores, there has sprung war as an enterprise of tribe against tribe, with the leaders and followers, with organized marches, surprises, and actions. Out of the annihilation of the vanquished springs the law that is imposed upon the vanquished. Human law is ever a law of the stronger to which the weaker must conform. And this law, considered as something permanently valid between tribes, constitutes peace. Such a peace also prevails within the tribe, so that its forces may be available for action outwards. The state is the internal order of a people. The state is the internal order of a people for its external purpose. The state is a form, a possibility, what the history of a people is actually. The state is a form as possibility. Oh my God. The state is as form as possibility, what the history of a people is as actuality. But history, of old as new, is war history. Politics is only a temporary substitute for war that uses more intellectual weapons. And the male part of a community is originally synonymous with its host. The character of the free beast of prey passes over, in its essential features, from the individual to the organized people. The animal with one soul and many heads. The techniques of government, war, and diplomacy have all the same root and have in all ages a profound inward relationship with each other. There are peoples whose strong breed has kept the character of the beast of prey, seizing, conquering, and lording peoples, lovers of the fight against men, who leave the economic fight against nature to others, whom in due course they plunder and subject. Piracy is as old as navigation, the raiding of the trade route as old as nomadism, and wherever there is peasantry, there is enslavement to a warlike nobility. For with the organization of undertakings comes the separation of the political and the economic sides of life, that directed towards power, and that directed towards booty. We find not merely an internal articulation of the people according to activities, warriors and workers, chiefs and peasants, but also the organization of whole tribes for a single economic occupation. Even then, there must have been hunting, cattle breeding, and agricultural tribes, mining, pottery, and fishing villages, political organizations of seafarers and traders, and over and above these, conqueror peoples without economic occupation at all. I will have to take a sip quickly. Okay, let's read that again. Even then, there must have been hunting, cattle breeding, and agricultural tribes, mining, pottery, and fishing villages, political organization of seafarers and traders, and over and above these, conqueror peoples without economic occupation at all. The harder the battle for power and booty, the closer and stricter the bonding of the individuals by law and force. In the tribes of this primitive sort, the individual life mattered little or nothing. For consider that in every sea voyage, the Icelandic sagas are illuminating here, only a proportion of the ships reached port, that in every great building task, no small part of the workmen perished, that whole tribes starved in time of drought. Clearly, of drought. Clearly, all that matters was that enough were left to represent the spirit of the whole. The numbers decreased rapidly, but what was felt was The numbers decreased rapidly, but what was felt as annihilation was not the loss of one or even of many, but the extinction of the organization of the we. In this increasing interdependence lies the quiet and deep revenge of nature upon the being that has wrested from her the privilege of creation. This petty creator against nature, this revolutionary of the world of life, has become the slave of his creation, of his creature. The culture, the aggregate of artificial, personal, self-made life forms, develops into a close-barred cage for the souls that would not be restrained. The beast of prey, who made other systematic animals in order to exploit them, has taken himself captive. The great symbol of this fact is the human house. That and his increasing numbers, in which the individual disappears as unimportant, for it is one of the most fateful consequences of the human spirit of enterprise that the population multiplies. Where anciently the pack of a few hundreds roamed, there is sitting a people of tens of thousands. There are scarcely any regions empty of men. People border on people, and the mere fact of the frontier, the limit of one's own power, arouses the old instincts to hate, to attack, to annihilate. The frontier, of whatever kind it may be, even the intellectual frontier, is the mortal foe of the will to power. It is not true that human techniques saves labor, for it is an essential characteristic of the personal and modifiable techniques of man, in contrast to genus techniques, that every discovery contains the possibility and necessity of new discoveries. Every fulfilled wish awakens 1,000 more. Every triumph over nature incites to yet others. The soul of this beast of prey is ever hungry, his will never satisfied. That is the curse that lies upon this kind of life, but also the grandeur inherent in its destiny. It is precisely its best specimens that know least of quiet, happiness, or enjoyment, and no discoverer has ever accurately foreseen the practical effect of his act. The more fruitful the leader's work, the greater the need of executive hands. And so, instead of killing the prisoners taken from hostile tribes, men begin to enslave them, so as to exploit their bodily strengths. This is the origin of slavery, which must, therefore, be precisely as old as the slavery of domestic animals. In general, these peoples and tribes multiply, so to say, downwards. What grows is not the number of heads, but that of hands. The group of leader natures remains small. It is, in fact, the pack of the true beasts of prey, the pack of the gifted who dispose in one way or another of the increasing herd of the others. But even this lordship of the few is far removed from the ancient freedom. Witness Frederick the Great's saying, "I am the first servant of the state." Hence the desperate efforts of the exceptional man to keep himself inwardly free. Here, and only here, begins the individualism that is a reaction against the psychology of the mass. It is the last uprising of the carnivore soul against its captivity behind the bars of the culture, the last attempt to shake off the spiritual and intellectual limitations that are produced by and represented by the fact of large numbers. Hence, the life types of the conqueror, the adventurer, the hermit, and even certain types of criminals and bohemians. The wished-for escape from absorption by the large number takes various forms. Lordship over it, flight from it, contempt for it. The idea of personality in its dark beginnings is a protest against humanity in the mass. The mass. Let's read that again. The idea of personality in its dark beginnings is a protest against humanity in the mass. And the tension between these grows and grows to its tragic finale. Hate, the most genuine of all race feelings, in the beast of prey presupposes respect for the adversary. A certain recognition of like spiritual rank is inherent in it. Beings that stand lower one despises. Beings that themselves stand low are envious. All primitive folk tales, god myths, and hero sagas are full of such motifs. The eagle hates only his peers, envies none, despises many, and indeed all. Contempt looks downwards from the heights. Envy peers upwards from below. And these too are the world historical feelings of mankind organized in states and classes, whose forcefully peaceful specimen helplessly rattle the bars of the cage in which they are confined together. From this fact and its consequences, nothing can liberate them. So it was, and so it will be, and nothing at all will be, or nothing at all will be. It has a significance, this fact, of respect and contempt. To alter it is impossible. The destiny of man is pursuing its course and must accomplish itself. That was chapter 4. 42 minutes. It's quite long. Next time, meaning in 2 days, we'll do chapter 5, which will be even longer. Wow. Chapter 5 is actually the last chapter. Look at that. Yeah. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you will join me again in 2 days. Goodbye.